Welcome back to Dreaming Against the Machine. I'm your host, Adam Becker. I'm still not used to seeing strangers online talking about my work. You know, I'm just this guy. But when I see someone who I've heard of talking about my work, that's always a nice surprise and a kind of thrill. And that's how I encountered this week's guest, Shannon Vallor, a philosopher of AI and author of the book, The AI Mirror. I was familiar with her work, but I didn't know her. And then one day I logged on to Blue Sky and was surprised to see her there talking about my book, More Everything Forever. And I sent her a message and decided that it would be a good idea to have her on the show. But she's the first guest that we've ever had that I'd never even spoken with until we talked on the show. And I really wasn't sure how it would go, but we had a blast. She's thoughtful and engaging and funny, and I think you're going to enjoy it. So let's get to it. Shannon, welcome to Dreaming Against the Machine.
Thanks for having me. Really excited for the conversation.
Shannon, why don't you introduce yourself? I don't have your title right in front of me. I know who you are, but I don't think I could rattle off your title from memory.
It's kind of a mouthful. So I'm the Bailey Gifford Chair in the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the University of Edinburgh. So I am a philosopher by training, so I'm appointed in the philosophy department, but I work in an interdisciplinary institute called the Edinburgh Futures Institute, where I work with folks in philosophy, law, computer science, social sciences, looking at a range of issues around ethics and technology. And I co-direct a center there focused on these kinds of questions called the Center for Techno-Moral Futures.
You also wrote a book, The AI Mirror.
Yep. So my first book in 2016 was called Technology and the Virtues, a philosophical guide to a future worth wanting. And then in 2024, I wrote a book that was focused really on AI and the generative AI wave that was just breaking. And that book's called The AI Mirror: How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. And the title's a little bit of a trick because I don't think that machines actually think. But it's about also the ways that AI and the ways that we think about it and the ways it's marketed to us encourage us to develop more machine-like ways of thinking ourselves.
Say a little more about that. I have to admit, very sheepishly, I know about your book, but I haven't read your book. I want to read your book.
Great. I hope you do.
Or rather, your more recent book.
Yeah, I never judge anyone for not having read my work because I have a stack of books, including by friends, that I have yet to get to. So there's a lot out there. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I feel like there are people out in the world who do judge their colleagues and friends for not reading their books. And I don't like those people, and I don't want to be one of those people.
Yeah, that's not cool. Not cool, man.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, the AI Mirror grew out of some lectures I started doing all the way back in 2019, where I was trying to explain to lay audiences. This was back in Silicon Valley, where I was working for almost 20 years before I came to Scotland. And I was speaking to a lot of audiences that were kind of steeped in Silicon Valley culture and the assumptions about artificial intelligence that we've been carrying with us since the start of the field, 75 years ago. And a lot of those assumptions and a lot of that culture reinforces metaphors for AI that are really unhelpful. The most influential, of course, and seemingly obvious one is the metaphor of a mind. But what I'm arguing in the book is that that's actually a pretty terrible metaphor for understanding what artificial intelligence as a real commercial product in the world, not as an idea or a trope in science fiction. But the idea that these are machine minds is actually deeply misleading. And so I started looking for other metaphors to describe how to understand these technologies. And back in 2019, I was working with several metaphors at once. So one of my metaphors was the idea of AI as a prosthetic, something that can kind of extend human capabilities, but not replace the person. Mm-hmm. Another was the idea of AI as an accelerant. So my slides had an image of a gasoline can. The idea is that whatever you add AI to, you're likely to accelerate the dynamics that are already there, which means, for example, if you add this kind of AI to a world that has already a lot of racial or gender bias. You're going to accelerate that. If you add this kind of AI to a world with a lot of economic and political inequality, you're probably going to accelerate that. And the third metaphor that I had was the idea of AI as a mirror, that it doesn't actually have the properties of a mind. It's rather a reflection of data extracted from our minds. And it's really important then to understand the distinction between the reflection and the thing it reflects. So what I decided in 2024 was to focus the book on that metaphor alone, because that turned out to be the one that resonated with audiences most and helped them really understand these technologies in a way that countered a lot of the misleading narratives from AI companies in particular.
No, that makes sense.
And so the idea is also that mirrors aren't always faithful. They can be distorted.
Yep.
They can magnify certain things and occlude other things. So I drew on a lot of different optical properties of mirrors to try to tell stories about AI, including, for example, the idea that mirrors collect light that has already, in a sense, been emitted. And so they reflect the past, literally. That's why our mirrors on giant telescopes in space collect light from the early beginnings of the universe, right? Because the light has to travel so far to get to the mirror's surface. Well, there's an interesting fact about AI mirrors as well, which is that they only reflect the data that we've already generated. And they reflect the patterns in that data that are most common historically. So they tend actually to bring the past forward and present it as the future, which is really problematic when you actually need to grow and change and do things differently.
Oh, I love this. I already knew I needed to read your book, but I really need to read your book.
Oh, good. I sold
and
you.
I feel a little embarrassed that I'm interviewing you before I read your book. We're going to have to bring you back after I read it.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yeah, no, that would be fun. But I love this. I love this for so many reasons, right? One of the reasons I love this is I'm a cosmologist by training.
Oh,
And
perfect.
so,
That's right. I forgot about
and
that.
so, yeah, exactly. So, mirrors reflecting the past. Absolutely. Of course, that's what they do. And of course, mirrors have like weird optical properties and can distort things, not just funhouse mirrors, but, magnifying and convex and concave mirrors, but also, um, just from the perspective of someone who still lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and at some point I'm gonna want to know when and how you left, but I see this everywhere here. It is the future, and I am just seeing it reflect back at people what they already believe. And I'm not just talking about the AI psychosis stuff.
Right.
Here's something that yeah, you'll know what I'm talking about, but people who don't live here in the Bay might not. We're gonna have to explain it a little bit. The billboards along
Oh, God.
101,
Oh,
yeah,
God.
between the Bay Bridge and SFO.
Yes. Blotting out the sun.
Blotting out the sun. Yeah, absolutely. So those billboards have always been, well, not always, but like, for the past, 15 years at least, those billboards have been primarily aimed at like startup tech VC culture, right? Venture capital stuff. Um, they have not been billboards, primarily not been billboards for consumer products of any kind. It's mostly been what they call, what's that term? B2B, business to business stuff.
Yep.
And it's really not even been about trying to get anyone to buy what's on the billboard. It's mostly been prestige stuff, right?
Yes.
It's been like, we are a startup successful enough that we can afford a billboard on 101.
Yeah.
And
I think it's just another way to try to juice the stock.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's always been crazy. And it's always been stuff that's like nigh incomprehensible if you don't learn more about the tech industry than you ever really wanted to know. And then the AI bubble arrived, and all of that just got supercharged. And so now every single one of those billboards essentially is about some kind of AI product, but it just reflects the past. It's just the past, magnified and distorted.
And sold back to us as the future, which, the past is really useful. And this is something that I think is easy to lose sight of, for me in particular, as I get more and more frustrated about kind of the abuses of AI is that in my core, still believe in a world where AI is a good part of it. And there's so much that we can learn from our data. There's so much we can learn from not just our data, because actually, the book is really about models that are trained on us. But what's really happening is we're now seeing so much investment in large language models and their kin that we're underinvesting in the narrow applications of machine learning that are trained on other things.
Yep.
Data about what's going on with the climate. I mean, we've got some of that going on, sure. But data from all kinds of systems that we can learn more about by using advanced machine learning to solve real problems. So I don't want to discount the fact that the past is something that has stories to tell us that are worth hearing. But when you repackage it as knowledge, when you repackage it as wisdom, when you repackage it as the future, you're really selling short human capabilities for decision making, for making social progress. I'm working on a new book, and that's really the thrust of that one, is that this is in some ways kind of rolling back a lot of the potential that humans have invested in themselves and each other and in our institutions through various kind of movements to expand education and valorize human learning and innovation and creativity. And so I was really interested in reading your book because you talk a lot about, among other things, the kind of dark enlightenment movement that has developed out of this culture. And, they're just being really open about it. They are trying to roll back a lot of the elements of Enlightenment ideals that we rightly value. Not that the Enlightenment in Europe wasn't a deeply flawed and compromised and incomplete project, but the idea that these technologies, in a sense, remove the necessity for humans to keep learning, keep thinking, keep coming up with new and better ideas, because the AI is doing it when all it's doing it is giving us what we already know.
One of the other things I love about the way that you're phrasing this and the way that you're talking about this is exactly that history is important, right? But AI is reflecting history back at people who don't actually know or care about history, and an industry that likes to pretend that it doesn't have history, and so they're ignorant of history. And what's the old saying say that people who are ignorant of history, nothing bad happens to them and everything is awesome.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I could go on about this for ages. I won't, but I was recently at a academic workshop in Vienna that made me so happy because it was on the history and philosophy of artificial intelligence. And the organizer, Tim Crane, had invited as keynote speakers 3 philosophers and 3 historians of computing. And I was just so happy that whole week because I feel like history of computing, of technology regulation, of knowledge production is so much of the missing wisdom that compromises our ability in this century to make good decisions, to make decisions that really are wise and will lead us into reasonably desirable and sustainable futures versus leading us off a cliff, which is what a lot of the policies that we're currently doubling down on are doing, because they've memory hold the entire 20th century. I had a guy in a debate try to tell me that we didn't regulate the railroads. And his argument was like,
what?
He wasn't my debate opponent, by the way. He was a guy in the audience in the middle of the debate. A young man in a very expensive suit, but obviously deeply failed by his teachers, because he stood up with great confidence and said, you've been arguing for the necessity of regulation, better regulation and better governance of these technologies. But I think that's just obviously all wrong, because imagine what would have happened if we had regulated the railroads. It would have killed innovation in its cradle and all the economic growth that we got from the railroads. And I'm rarely speechless.
Yeah.
And I literally had to like just take a beat.
Yep.
And then I said, do you think we didn't regulate the railroads?
Yeah.
And, he just sort of blinked at me, and I had to go through the fact, you couldn't run a railroad for 10 miles without regulation, much less get it to kind of, link up with a broader transportation ecosystem. And anyway, and it was funny because the audience, when he was speaking, and the audience was broadly a lot older than he was, when he was speaking and saying, what would have happened if we'd regulated the railroads? We would have stifled innovation, blah, blah, blah. The audience starts nodding their heads. And I'm looking at these, these old heads. I'm like, better. So then I point out the extensive regulation that supported the railroad industry and allowed it to grow and allowed it to generate all of the economic and other benefits of mass transit. And then the gray-haired heads start nodding again as I'm speaking, like they're remembering, oh yeah, that happened. So yeah, I think history is really a missing piece, and we're being, I think, deliberately fed a kind of commercially designed amnesia.
Yeah. In
thinking that these technologies really capture everything that we have learned. Because of course, even though we say they're trained on the past, and it's true, they're trained on a very partial part of the past.
Yep.
And there's so much left out, and so much that was never digitized, and so many people whose voices and knowledge was never seen as valuable enough to save and archive, much less digitize. And then on top of that, half of it is Reddit posts from the last, 15 years. And I would not trust your average, Reddit forum to be an authority on whether we regulated the railroads. Although actually, some of those forums are actually pretty good.
Well, yeah, it depends on which ones, right?
Yeah.
But like, oh God, no, it's a sanitized version of the past. And in particular, it's this libertarian fantasia of the past, right? This idea that first of all, that the New Deal did nothing good, and that government regulation was invented either by FDR or by TR. Right? One of the Roosevelts did it, right?
Yeah.
And that, before we had income tax, everything was awesome.
Yeah.
And you know this already because you read my book, but like one of the sort of running themes of my book that I never explicitly stated is like, libertarianism just doesn't work and doesn't really make any sense, and runs on an interlocking set of denials about science, history, politics, and yet you have this hyper libertarian ethos that is baked into the culture of Silicon Valley from the start of the internet, right? This so-called Californian ideology, and then it gets reflected back to us by these AIs that are supposed to be oracles that tell us what, or well, not oracles that tell us the future, but representatives of the future, like instantiations of the future that are here now.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny too, because the kind of libertarian voices that are out there, almost none of them are actually consistent anyway. So, I mean, libertarianism, if you were consistent about it, would fail. But also, I don't know how many times, libertarians have suddenly gone weirdly quiet when it's time for bailouts by the government, right? Of big industry or banks, or when it's time to silence those who challenge these kinds of values in universities. I mean, it's just amazing to see, for example, how, and not all of these were, self-professed libertarians, but the whole sort of campus free speech from the right movement in the United States. We have to have viewpoint diversity. We have to ensure that no one in academia is punished for what they write or what they say. And then suddenly, the Trump administration comes in and rips the guts out of free speech by silencing anyone they can who is directly or indirectly receiving federal funds. And suddenly all the free speech advocates on the right and all the libertarians just go so quiet.
Yeah.
Or they say, the left did it to themselves. It's because people were too loud about, thinking that trans people are human beings that this happened to you. So
Yeah, I have no patience for that. But again, I care about history and try to remember what things happened and then learn about things that happened before I was born, and the people in this industry don't. And libertarians, I mean, this is, I agree with everything that you just said. And it's also making me think about one of the real surprises that I ran into when writing the book. I probably should have known this, but somehow didn't. I
mhm.
was confused that I kept running into libertarians talking about pseudoscientific, like debunked, quote unquote, race science. And at first I was like, okay, this person is a libertarian and they're a racist. And then this person's a libertarian and also a racist. And it kept coming up. And I
Yeah.
didn't understand what the connection was, but I could tell that there was one. And so I went and had a conversation with a friend who was a former libertarian
hmm
and asked her, hey, what's going on here? There has to be a story. And she connected dots that I really, in retrospect, were very obvious. But of course, it takes someone steeped in that community who knew it well to like hit me over the head with this. But and also she's very smart, to be clear. But like she said, libertarians need to believe that there's a level playing field.
Yeah.
And if you have to believe that there's a level playing field, then you have to believe that systematic and systemic inequalities are caused by something that is internal to the people that are on the playing field, because you also have to believe that, like there's no such thing as society and that everything is an internal thing and we don't need each other.
That's right.
And every man is an island. And
Absolutely.
so if you believe all of that, then you end up having to believe that certain races of people are just inferior to others. Because otherwise, why is it that white people make more money than black people in the US and so on and so forth? And that was a very unpleasant thing to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
and that's exactly, I mean, that diagnosis is spot on.
Yeah.
I remember when I started teaching in the late 90s, early O's, even then every once in a while, you'd get a bright student who'd come into your office and they were all excited because someone had given them a book by Ayn Rand and they wanted to
Oh,
talk about it.
God.
Yeah. And you just have to kind of not judge, not roll your eyes, but talk them through what they think this means. And it was always really interesting to realize the kind of articles of faith that you have to cling to in order for this to be, a remotely plausible or attractive worldview. And a lot of the young people that were initially attracted to these ideas, I think for some of them, initially, it really was this idea that I want to believe in a world that has a level playing field because I don't know how to cope with a world that has always been unjust. I don't know how to
Mhm.
cope with a world that has systemic problems when I feel like I'm an individual that can only do a little bit to change the world. So sometimes it was this idea that there was something comforting about this illusion. But other times you could see that there were people for whom they really needed to believe that their own advantages were deserved. Particularly when I was teaching in institutions where a disproportionate number of the students came from very privileged economic backgrounds, they didn't want to question those advantages, and they wanted to believe that they stood on a level playing field and had never been given a leg up, which was always sad to me because
Yeah.
they got into college. There's so much opportunity. You can just let that go and focus on what you're actually doing now.
Yep.
No one's asking you to feel guilty about having gotten into an expensive university, right? But they really had this kind of fear of not having earned their status and
Yeah.
needing a worldview that would tell them that every bit of success or advantage they had was something that they could claim.
Yes, I have seen this and I completely agree. But I also can't resist quoting one of my favorite sort of internet quotes from a guy named John Rogers.
Hmm.
There are two novels that can change a bookish 14-year-old's life: The Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugged. One is a childish fantasy that often engenders a lifelong obsession with its unbelievable heroes, leading to an emotionally stunted, socially crippled adulthood, unable to deal with the real world. The other, of course, involves orcs.
That's a great one. I really do
Yeah.
love that one. Yeah, I have another one that I have a saved image of. It's a cartoon panel, and it's a like a 50s styled housewife mom feeding her kid at the table, who's some like tow-headed, 10-year-old boy or something, and he says um, something like, "Mom, I want to be a libertarian when I grow up." And the next panel is her saying, "Well, honey, you can't do both."
Oh God.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, this is clearly what this podcast does now, Dreaming Against the Machine, where we just rag on libertarians all episode long. Unfortunately, we still live in capitalism, and that means we need to talk about our partners and sponsors. But fortunately, our partners and sponsors are great. And if you want to support Dreaming Against the Machine directly, you can join us on Patreon, where $5 a month gives you the chance to ask questions of upcoming guests and a dedicated stream of cat pictures. We love our patrons, and we also love being a part of the Multitude Collective at multitudeshows.com. Multitude is a podcast company made up of passionate people creating shows you can count on. Shows like Wow If True. Wow If True is your one-stop internet culture shop, explaining how what's happening online shapes the real world. The hosts, tech culture journalist Amanda Silberling and science fiction author/attorney Isabel J. Kim, Esquire, are internet experts and real-life besties asking and answering your burning questions about the internet. Why are the edgelord tech bros literally everywhere, even in the White House? Are the AI overlords coming to take our jobs? And if so, why are these AIs so awful at playing Pokemon? It's the only podcast that will mention Neopets and horizontal mergers in the same episode. So check out Wow If True wherever on the internet you find your podcasts. New episodes every other Wednesday. And here's a word from our sponsors. One of this week's sponsors is Shaker and Spoon, a monthly cocktail and mocktail subscription. Full disclosure, they sent me a free box this month, and I'm excited to try it on a night off soon. Each box includes 3 original recipes from award-winning bartenders, with enough ingredients to make 4 of each of those drinks for at least 12 drinks in total. And each box includes everything you need to make the drink except for the alcohol, and they're built around 1 spirit per box, so you really just need 1 bottle of something that you probably already have on hand if you drink. And if you don't drink, every box includes 0 proof options for every recipe, and some of the drinks are designed to be completely spirit-free from the start. The boxes come with recipe cards that include guidance on mixing techniques and glossary of terms that teach you how to shake, stir, build, and garnish these unusual cocktails with eclectic ingredients. And they also include everything else that you need to try out these drinks, like custom syrups, bitters, extracts, garnishes, and aromatics. And so you can try the drinks without going off and buying full bottles of niche ingredients that you'll never use again. It's a great idea for date nights or hosting a party or bringing a gift to someone else's party. And you can always skip or swap boxes or even just buy individual kits or ingredients without subscribing. So you can try this stuff out at their website, shakerandspoon.com. Use code DATM for 10% off your purchase. The other thing that I was thinking when you were talking about these experiences with these students whose lives were changed by Atlas Shrugged and not Lord of the Rings, or maybe both, like Peter Thiel, but And we do really need to do an episode at some point about how bad Peter Thiel is at reading Lord of the Rings. But
Oh God, yeah.
yeah, I know it's everywhere. But
And Gerard and the Bible.
oh yeah, and everything, like just
Yeah.
bad at reading.
Yeah.
And also not just Thiel, but Andre, right? And then
Yeah.
suddenly we're, yeah, back at all the stuff I was talking about in my book. But I was thinking about conspiracy theories, right? There's a way in which this is reminding me of the reasons that people get really into conspiracy theories, right? They want to have a picture of the world that is like less scary and more ordered
Yeah.
than the like large, chaotic, uncontrolled world that we live in. And B, they want this theory to also like reinforce things that they already wanted to believe.
Yeah.
And in that sense, this kind of libertarianism looks kind of like a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it exists on a spectrum.
Yeah.
No one is immune, right, from the desire to have the world conform to your expectations, to your values, to your hopes, and for it to make sense. And yeah, the world in a lot of ways doesn't make sense and has never made sense. And the whole field of philosophy exists because it just doesn't make sense to people. And so they spend their whole lives trying to wrestle with that. So I am, as a philosopher, deeply sympathetic to this compulsion to make meaning, to tell a rational story, to create this kind of ordered wrapper around the world. But where my patience ends is when it starts hurting people.
Yeah.
And we're long past that point with libertarianism.
Yes, that's certainly true. And I'm going to bring it back to AI. You were saying that the primary analogy that people use for AI is a mind or a brain. And of course it goes in the other direction as well, right? The primary analogy that people use for the brain or the mind is a computer. That's not anything new. Comparing the brain or the mind to something mechanical, especially like the most complicated or influential machine around at the time, is something that humans have been doing for centuries.
Yeah.
But I wonder about why people are resistant to having that analogy pushed back against, right? Like I push back against this idea in my book. I've seen other people do it. I could tell stories of the genre. I went to a party in San Francisco and someone said a thing, which, is always something unhinged, right? Like I went to a party in San Francisco and I said that large language models and deep learning networks are really nothing like the human mind, and got the response, no, they're just like it. They really want to learn.
Yeah.
Which is like, and then I pushed back on it and he just repeated it word for word. I'm like, okay, we're done. I die. You're not hearing what I'm saying, but like, this is.
There's something that you can see happen particularly in computer science, where there is a desire, again, to kind of have this ordered framework and a projection of that onto everything that exists. And it's not as if there are no similarities at all, right?
Yeah.
But that allows people to take those rather thin similarities and then kind of blow them up into an equation of the two things. I have been in so many intensive workshops. I was just at one last month at the Santa Fe Institute, where I think you've spent time before.
I was about to say, I love the Santa Fe Institute.
Yeah, we had a whole week there talking about intelligence and what it is.
Did you see Melanie Mitchell?
Yes, she organized the workshop.
Oh man,
yeah,
I should drop her an email. No, she's the best.
She's amazing. Yeah. But the workshop was full of not just philosophers and computer scientists, but neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, people who work on comparative studies of intelligence with humans and other animals, right? Yeah. And once you get that full complement of scientific expertise in the room, it is so obvious that the brain is a computer only in this very loose, metaphorical, constructed sense, and that the brain is its own very messy, weird kind of thing. It is a kludgy hodgepodge of different systems that evolved on top of each other and interacted with a complex changing environment to produce these kind of weird composites of modular systems talking to each other, integrating. And no one would build a computer that looks like that, right?
Yeah.
Because no one built the brain. It's not
Yeah.
a designed system.
Yep.
And in some ways, it's simpler and more elegant and more efficient than any designed computer. And in other ways, it's more chaotic and kind of senseless in its design than you could imagine. And so just understanding the brain as this marvelous, weird, freaky thing that evolution on this planet produced really helps you kind of just break that illusion that, oh, it's a computer. Now, there's, of course, what a lot of people do is they then try to salvage the idea by defining computation so loosely that it can describe literally anything in the universe. And so that's the other strategy that philosophers and computationists will sometimes do is they'll say, well, the brain isn't a digital computer, but it's a computer in the sense, that it processes information. And you're just like, come on, right?
Yeah.
And then they have, of course, a definition of information that is so comprehensive that it describes every object in the universe as doing computation. So it is really, I think, caused more confusion about what the brain is, what intelligence is, what minds are, than any other idea in the last 100 years. And I'll put in a plug for my colleague at the University of Edinburgh, Masvita Chiramuda, who wrote a book called The Brain Abstracted, which really looks at this from the standpoint of philosophy of neuroscience, and understanding the ways in which the computational model is just a very limited abstraction that helps us model certain features of what the brain is doing in a way that's practically useful for science, but becomes completely obscuring of reality when we take it as a literal theory of what the brain is.
No, you're reminding me of a book that I'm going to plug, Matthew Cobb's book, The Idea of the Brain.
I haven't read it, but I've heard good things.
Oh yeah, no, it's really good. And there's a line in there that I liked so much that I quoted it in my book because I couldn't find a better way to express it. He says something like, the brain is more like a computer than it is like a clock.
Right.
But really, it's not like either of those things because computers and clocks were designed, and the brain is something that evolved.
And I think the idea also that the brain is a computer is attractive to people who want to deny both the contribution of the environment to intelligence and the contribution of the parts of the body that aren't the brain. So the brain, of course, is part of an entire physical system situated in a physical environment that makes a tremendous amount of difference, both to its development and its actual functioning. And that was, again, the nice thing about the Santa Fe Institute workshop is we spent so much time talking about all the ways that what the brain is doing depends on so many things that are not the brain and is coupled with things that are not the brain. And there was debate about this. There were people who, wanted to argue for a much more kind of brain-centric understanding of intelligence than others in the room. But no one was arguing that somehow you can take everything that represents the intelligent functioning of an animal and just describe what's inside the skull and that's going to capture it. But the idea that the brain alone carries all of our capabilities is really attractive if things like digital uploading, right, are fantasies that you cling to. If you've got plans, to throw your brain into cryo storage and let it turn into goo there, right? You've got to believe that the brain is enough and that the brain can be modeled computationally, because you're not going to actually, put that physical brain anywhere. You're going to somehow try to extract some computational model of it, and then have that be the thing that can do everything your brain does, which again, makes this kind of map is not the territory kind of mistake.
It's attractive believing that everything that you are and all of your intelligence is just your brain
Hmm.
is very attractive if you want to ignore particular parts of the environment like everybody else, and you really
Yes,
want to just believe that it's all just you, like a libertarian.
exactly.
Or it's also very attractive if you want to believe that everything is computation and that computer science is the most important thing that there is, which is very attractive if you're a software engineer.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
For much of history, philosophers were convinced that our discipline was the kind of thing that the smartest people did and the thing that got to the deepest truths
Yep.
about the world. And we were always fighting with mathematicians and physicists about this, right? Because, of course, the mathematicians had a very different view of this. And it's
Yes.
now just evolved right into it being the computer scientists who believe not only that they are really good at programming and understanding computation, but that means that they are good at understanding literally everything else in the
Yep.
universe. So it's partly just this kind of weird hierarchical obsession that has always plagued academia, but now again it's spilling over and kind of causing damage outside of academic departments, and that's something that unfortunately we can't afford.
As a physicist, um, I some of the impetus behind my book was me like looking at the software engineers and computer scientists saying such things and thinking, oh, okay. First of all, you've got physics envy. You
Yep.
keep talking about, how much better it would be if we could have a world made of bits rather than atoms. And that feels like a kind of academic professional thing, and also feels like you wanting to have a world that is tractable and made by people as opposed to trying to understand a world that people never made. But also speaking as a physicist who left academia and who, has spent a lot of time sort of studying the culture of physics, you don't want to be like physicists. There's, physics is great and all, but like the arrogance of some physicists, I'm not going to say that all physicists are like this, hashtag not all physicists, um, but the arrogance of some physicists in like parachuting into other fields and saying, oh, this is just physics. Physics is everything. Physics is all
Yep.
that we do. And like, okay, do do you know about any other field? I mean, I did an undergrad degree in philosophy, and a lot of physicists were like, well, why are you bothering with philosophy? Like, why aren't you? What about the other fields? Like,
Yeah.
physics is not at the bottom of absolutely everything. But speaking of my book, or my more recent book, in a way, I was just alluding to my first book, "What is Real?" Available wherever fine books are sold. But speaking of more everything forever, we're getting close to the end here, and I want to bring it back to why I brought you onto this podcast in the first place, which is you went on Blue Sky and said a bunch of really nice things about my book, which was not enough to have me bring someone on the podcast by itself, though I love it when people say nice things about my books. Um, but you also said that you disagreed with me. And that's when I was like, oh, okay, I already know about Shannon, but she likes my book, but she disagrees with me about something. Oh, I gotta have her on the podcast.
Yeah, so I think the disagreement is a very soft disagreement, and
Well, that's the
maybe,
best kind.
and maybe, yeah, maybe I'm also. I mean, this is an interesting opportunity to kind of hear your response, because it may be that I am misreading something that wasn't really part of the message of the book. But towards the end of the book, you have this really affecting, actually, a reflection on your own early fascination with technology, with things like space travel and colonization, and this belief that these are the things that actually carry us into the future that we want.
Yeah.
And that resonated really deeply with me, because I had a very similar trajectory myself. I was a
Yeah.
giant sci-fi nerd, and
Yep.
I programmed computers as a little kid in my bedroom, and just was I didn't study the philosophy of technology so that I could dismiss the value of technology. I love technology. I always have. And it's always been both a fascination and an affection of mine. But as you sort of see the, abuses and distortions of the tech industry and the failings really to deliver on the idea that technology is something that brings us comfort, that technology is something that makes the world more livable, that technology is something that makes the future more secure and accessible for more of us, right? That dream that that's what technology does feels like it's slipping away. And I wrote a
Yeah.
piece for MIT Technology Review, I think in maybe 2015, maybe it was that old. I'm not sure. It might have been more recent. That was like, we used to get excited about technology. What happened? And it was really about, kind of that loss of love for tech that can come. But here's what I saw in your book that it felt like maybe you had gone a little further down that road than I have, or
Mm.
that maybe you didn't have quite as much hope anymore that technologies, including technologies associated with space exploration and things like that, but technologies like AI itself, it felt like maybe you were no longer convinced that these have a big role to play in helping humans progress, helping humans live better together, helping humans have a more sort of sustainable and desirable future on this planet. And I'm still clinging to that in a lot of ways. A lot of the criticism of AI that I see, for example, on Blue Sky, even when it's well founded, at times, tonally, it seems to me to be giving away the game, basically, and
Mm.
saying AI is garbage, tech is not going to save us. And of course, it's not going to save us. And I'm absolutely not one of these kind of techno solutionist people who thinks that every social problem is a problem for an engineer to solve or a software developer to solve. And it's almost never the case that it's their
Yeah.
problem to solve. But I don't want to give away, if you will, the idea that technology is for people and that technology is a power that we have and have always had, that we've had it since we climbed down from the trees, a way of remaking the world to meet one another's needs and our own. And I don't want to surrender that to the Zuckerbergs and the Teals and the Altmans, right? I don't want them to be able to claim that. I want us to keep that for a more kind of egalitarian social and political vision. So I'm curious whether you think you're more cynical than I am about that. And if you are, maybe how we might address that dispute.
Oh man, there's always like a little part of me in the back of my head that wants to give flip answers to absolutely every single question.
Yep.
And so the flip answer that's coming to mind is, no, you're just seeing the fact that like you left the bay and I'm still stuck here.
I
That's
get
all
it.
you were seeing in the book, yeah. And I am curious about like your journey here and then away from here, but we can talk about that later. But it's a good question. It's also striking to me that I've had several people, friendly people, friends, in the sort of AI ethics, tech critical space say things to me like, yeah, I really liked your book, but I was surprised by how easy you went on the tech bros in it at the beginning. But, by the end, you really brought the fire. I'm like,
Yeah,
I understand why they're saying that, but I did that because I didn't want to lose my audience straight out of the gate.
sure.
I wanted to make it clear that I was giving these people a fair shake and they were just, you know, utterly failing. But I I don't know that we disagree that much, if at all. I am not, in the pejorative sense of the term, I'm not a Luddite. I think I'm a Luddite maybe in the non-pejorative sense of the term, in that I want to take human power back from the tech industry.
Yeah,
Um, but I I am not, someone who thinks that we have to smash every machine and like give up all technology. I don't think that we could even if we wanted to. I also tend to take a fairly expansive view of what the word technology means. There are social
yes,
technologies, right?
yes. So
like
important.
political organizational structures and whatnot.
I think ethics is a technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways it's one of our oldest technologies and also the one that we've worked on the hardest because it's a really difficult one to get
Yeah,
right.
that's right.
I mean, this is one of the I mean, now I'm gonna be preaching to the choir here, but, like, one of the things that gets me when people criticize philosophy, which I heard a lot when I was actually in college and studying philosophy, was, "Well, but philosophy hasn't produced anything useful. The philosophers have just been studying the same questions over and over for thousands of years." Like, "Okay, what if that just means the questions are really hard?"
Yeah.
And
There's a
ethics is really hard.
there's a great essay by Bertrand Russell.
Yeah.
It's the last essay in the Problems of Philosophy. It's called The Value of Philosophy. And he
Mhm.
basically argues that the reason that it appears that philosophy doesn't make any progress is every time philosophers solve a problem or find a path to the solution for the problem, it breaks off from philosophy and
Yep.
just becomes a science, right?
Yep.
Physicists used to be called natural philosophers, right? So
Yes,
you
indeed.
all used
Yeah.
to be philosophers. And in some ways, what you're doing is still part of the kind of philosophical impulse. It's just you're able to figure out the kind of methods that would actually deliver progress in that field. And what's left in philosophy is all the hardest stuff,
Right.
like ethics.
Yeah, and I also think that, the boundaries between the disciplines are, something that we make up, right?
Oh,
And that
absolutely.
really there's just this one broad human endeavor that we are all engaged in, and so in that sense, you also can't cut off technology because that's part of it too, and it's part
That's
of the
right.
human experience. Humans, evolved the way that we did in part because we learned how to deal with fire and work
Hmm.
together, and these are technologies, but, um and yet, libertarians still think that you can do everything by yourself. Anyway, I will never get tired of getting a dig in at them. But, I think it's the techno solutionism. One of the things I'm sort of embarrassed to admit is that I actually hadn't encountered the term techno solutionism until after I was done with the book. There
Hmm.
are all sorts of scholars in this field whose work I was, kind of ignorant of. Uh, Not because I didn't do research. I think I did a lot of research, but there's so much,
There
and
is.
in my heart, I think everyone who's, like, self-aware, and doing, like, work in the world suffers from some imposter syndrome because otherwise, you're like, I don't know, some kind of sociopath, but,
Insufferable.
yeah, insufferable is probably a nicer way to put it, but yes.
Somewhere on the
Um
spectrum from insufferable to sociopath.
Yes, exactly, yes, whatever that spectrum is called, yeah. I at the end of the day, I always feel like I'm a physicist cosplaying as a historian, anthropologist, sociologist, journalist, what have you. I mean, in a way, the flip answer I wanted to give is not really a joke. The culture here in the Bay is so steeped in techno solutionism that they can't see it. It's the water that they swim in, right? It's the old
Absolutely.
joke of, like, the fish that doesn't know what water is.
Yep.
And so to push back on it effectively, I felt like I had to push as hard as I did in the book. I do say at the end of the book, I think technology is part of the answer to solving some of our problems. And certainly, to pick an example not at random at all, I think that, say, vaccines are a wonderful technology that I would very much not want to get rid of and would like to see a lot more of. So I don't know that we disagree. And actually, I'm going to finish this rambling answer by talking about space because of course I am.
Yeah.
It's very funny to me that funny, interesting, that I've been brought on to a bunch of radio shows and podcasts and whatnot in the last year since the book came out, uh, to, be the person making the case, against space colonization.
Hmm.
Because to me, space colonization just seems like such a small thing in the grand scheme of space, right? Like, love space. Of course I do. And that's not just, oh, I grew up reading a lot of science fiction and I'm still a sci-fi junkie. I am. And that's not, I watched a lot of Carl Sagan as a kid. I did. I have a PhD in astrophysics, although I do. But to me, space is a place that I want to know more about.
Yes.
It's a place to explore intellectually. It is a wonderful place to send robots. Something that I say in my book that I'm sure you caught, but a lot of people don't seem to have caught that I
Yeah.
said that.
Yeah.
And I would love to see us sending even more probes out into space and more space telescopes. And I just don't think that it makes any sense to send large numbers of people to work and live in space
No.
because there's no case for that. And I also think that it's very interesting that that is like the primary modality that people have in mind for like what is the future of human interaction with space. Whereas I feel like, okay, I want to explore with a light touch. There's no call for going there. And it's surprising to me, although I suppose it shouldn't be, how many people have trouble imagining a human future of interaction with space that is something other than just doing a colonialism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and like the amount of references that people give to like Columbus
Hmm.
specifically
Yep.
when talking about space colonization. Like, okay, you understand that you're giving the game away right there. But all of this is to say, I think that there is something gorgeous about sending these probes into space. Because one of the other questions that people will ask is, okay, but what's the point? Why are we spending all of this money? And I always feel like, okay, when it comes to sending the probes out there, that's a false dichotomy. There's so many other things that we spend so much money
Yeah.
on that we should be taking money away from to spend on priorities here on Earth. And if it really was a choice between sending a probe to Venus and feeding people here on Earth, of course I'd choose to feed people here on Earth. That's just not the choice that we face. But in a way, my answer to your question is I don't like it when people try to justify sending probes to space by talking about all of the spin-off technologies that we get
Yeah.
that help us here on Earth,
Yep.
because that's, I think, dishonest and disingenuous because it's not why we're doing it. And I think
Hmm.
it's very important to be explicit about why we're doing it. We're doing it because we're curious and we want to know the answer. Colonization is not a universal human impulse
Right.
across all cultures. Curiosity is.
Yeah.
Uh, Wanting to explore the world around us and find out answers to questions is. And I think that, technology is wonderful for that. It's part of that, but it's not the whole story any more than it's the whole story of how do we solve these massive problems that we're facing. So I don't know that we disagree very much. I think it is a tonal thing. And the more I think about it, the more I actually think that little voice in the back of my head that gave the flip answer was right. It would be a very different book if I didn't live here in the thick of it.
Yeah, I get it. And I had a friend who went and did a fellowship out there in the past couple of years. I left in 2020. Um, she
That's
she
smart.
she went back about 2 years ago, and she came back and she was like, and she was out there in kind of big tech circles for that entire time. She came back. She said,
Yeah.
"Shannon, it's a cult." And she
Yeah.
says, "I know that sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not exaggerating. I don't know how else, there's no other way to describe it. It's a cult.
Yep.
You go to a dinner party, there's a language you have to speak, and if you step outside of that, suddenly the room goes cold and quiet, and it looks like every cult movie, or horror movie you've ever seen about a kind of groupthink that becomes aggressive. So yeah, it's absolutely natural to recoil from that so fully, that you kind of just want to distance yourself from the whole kind of tech world. And so yeah, I can see that the closer you are physically and socially to it, probably the harder it is to keep that sort of affection and hopefulness around technology, in at least in the short term.
Yeah.
But I think obviously we probably do agree that, in the long run, we have to be able to bring technology back into the fold of
Yeah.
the human experience. We have to bring it back into the fold of moral and political progress. And that's the only way, I think, to imagine ourselves happy.
Well, I can't think of a better place to end it than that. So, Shannon, I am going to read your book and we should talk about it. This was so much fun. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you. And if you're ever coming through Edinburgh or visiting the UK and looking to make a stop in Edinburgh, let me know and we'll set it up.
Thanks again to this week's guest, Shannon Vallor. Next week, we have author and astrophysicist and fellow Multitude host, Moya McTeer. To submit questions for future guests and to suggest other guests, and to see more pictures of Babka, join the conversation on Patreon. You can also find us on YouTube, on Instagram at DATMpod, on the web and on Blue Sky at dreamingagainstthemachine.com, or just find us wherever you get your podcasts. Dreaming Against the Machine is a proud member of Multitude Productions. Our executive producer is Nick Carissimi. Our associate producer is Rosie Thomas. Our theme music is by Jared Emerson Johnson. Our show logo is by Nick James. And our fearless leader is Babka, the greatest cat in the observable universe. I'm Adam Becker, and I'll see you next week.